brothers, do you recall when the grasslands reached to the horizon? And the deafening roar of countless wings overhead. Back when Rome was a village and Britain the Emerald Island. Before we gave up on our future and buried our dead.
Episode 42, I believe. And last time we talked about the Hurrites. And this time we are talking about the kingdom of Urartu, which is very scantily known in the West, mostly by professionals. Though it's better known than some of the other peoples and kingdoms we were going to, and various state structures we're going to be talking about a little bit later on. Now, I'm going to tell you guys up front, there's a lot of material on this kingdom, and we may do a 2 episode just because I believe that it is such an outstanding cultural, I mean, this is the place where they believe metallurgy might have originated as such. This is the place where Jason traveled to acquire his golden rune from where he brought back a wife. This is the kingdom that rivaled with Assyria, the battle with Assyria for centuries. It's kind of fought neck to neck, nose to nose, so to speak, almost equal. These are the people who prevented Assyria from taking over the rest of a lot of the places, because Assyria spent so much time fighting with these peoples that they just lost. I mean, it's kind of like Soviet Union and United States, right? When you have 2 huge states that are both trying to build their military machines, eventually one of them runs out of the funding and resources. But anyway, so this is a very outstanding and a very significant civilization that had an absolutely enormous impact on the rest of the world. As we talked last time a little bit about the Hurrites, most people don't know that a lot of things in the Bible, even things in Sumerian mythology and Sumerian folklore, some of the images of gods that are commonly associated with Assyria, with Babylon, for example, the bull was a human torso, that kind of an image. Those bulls, they come from the Caucasus region. And if you look here, here's the Black Sea, and now we'll redo this is Elbrus Mountain, Elbrus, and what is marked in brown is what is called the Armenian Highlands. Now it's called the Armenian Highlands because today, and for a long time, that was territory of Armenia. This is, for example, the kingdom of Urartu against modern boundaries of states. So as you can see, Urartu at different times, I mean, was smaller, was bigger, but it occupied a lot of the territory that is now held by, occupies a lot of the territory that is now held by Turkey, that now is held by various Middle East states, a lot of Mesopotamian states. I mean, the size of it fluctuated greatly. Here's its capital, and that's Tushpa. There's the Lake Vaughan, which we're going to be talking about quite a bit. And this is territory right here. Again, I'm going to go to the map of where roughly, I mean, this whole area right here is the Armenian plateau, the Armenian Highlands, and a lot of different Caucasian cultures. Their genesis actually took place there, that they came from there originally. And then they split into different groups, such as Hurrites, such as Urartu, such as some of the other groups we will be talking about later. Now, Urartu language is not Armenian. Okay, I want to say as a disclaimer right now, I'm aware that there's a lot of political debate right now going over who has the right to call themselves the descendants of or the inheritors of the Urartu heritage. Armenians, Azerbaijani people, a lot of other people from Caucasus all can and do claim themselves to be in one way or another the beneficiaries or the descendants or maybe cultural descendants of this great civilization, because this civilization really was absolutely incredible and very early. And all of that is to a point true, and none of that is to a point true, because Urartians as such, as a people, as an ethnic group, which we will talk about whether or not that was even such an ethnic group, as a language group, they ceased existing. And that I will save that intrigue for the end of this whole conversation, because when they ceased existing will surprise you greatly. Nonetheless, they don't exist anymore, but they left their imprint on civilizations all across both sides of Caucasus, really. They impacted, they changed history in their war with Assyria. They left their linguistic traces in Armenian language, a lot of other Caucasian languages, Georgian language to a point, and their language was most closely related to the Hurrian language, which is why it's called the Hurrian Urartu linguistic group, which is closely related to some of the other Caucasian groups, but not identical. So there's a lot of debate about what these peoples, this territory, this state should and can be called, because there were many, many names. We've all heard of the Mount Ararat, right? Where the, Noah lost his ark, where his ark landed, where modern day explorers go searching for the lovely ark. Well, they're searching on the wrong mountain. They're searching on the wrong mountain, because the original mountain called Ararat, if it existed, was actually an entirely different mountain. And as often happens when tribes and peoples move, they take their familiar names of locations and move them with them, because of course it was a sacred mountain, and any peoples really hold the largest mountain nearby as sacred. But it's a possibility that it's not even the name of a mountain, that it is actually a misunderstanding. Other names for this region are Vainili, or so in Russian and English, B and V, they sometimes go back and forth. So Vainili or Vainili, would be a self-name that may or may not have something to do with the name of the lake Vaughan. There's another thing that explorers sometimes, explorers, scientists, archaeologists, researchers sometimes call this is Vaughan Kingdom, again, based on the name of the lake Vaughan, which I showed you a minute ago. I'm going to pull it back up again, which is kind of in the center of this territory, and it is a saltwater lake. So the really big and important lakes in this region are there's Sivan, and then there's Lake Vaughan, and then there's a third lake right here that plays a little bit less import, but we will talk about that a little bit later. Now you see here another name, it's called Nairi, right? That's another name that oftentimes is applied to this territory or these peoples. That name was mostly applied in early stages of Assyrian rise. Assyrians seem to be using that term, and it seems to mean something like the Norse, people from the Norse. So it may not be even an ethnic name. It may be basically Northerners. So it could mean all kinds of peoples, not just any one group. By the way, Ararat and Urartu, because we all remember that in some languages, especially in cuneiform, you don't usually write down vowels correctly, and you only have limited number of signs for the vowels. Well, in Assyrian and Sumerian, all of those cuneiforms, there was, because Ararat and Urartu, those vowels in there can be mutually replaceable. So there are some researchers who think that actually may be the exact same word. And either the mountain got called by the name of the peoples, or the people of the country, not the peoples, or the peoples of the country got named after the name of the mountain in question. There are other additional names for this particular location. But Babylonians called them one thing, Assyrians called them another thing, Sumerians called them yet another thing, and the Bible they mention as yet a third thing. So what these people actually call themselves, it seems that they most closely related to what researchers think their actual self-name would be something like B.I. Nili, but we got to understand that Urartu as a state, when it formed to be a state, was really made up of many diverse peoples, language groups, and different tribes. So the existence of Urartu as a union of various local tribes is for the first time mentioned in Assyrian documentation as far back as 1300 BC. And starting about 800 BC is when Urartu as a big and mighty state went away. But it doesn't mean that it stopped existing as a geographical and national location. Now, Urartu was discovered for the first time in the beginning of the 19th century. And the reason why they discovered it is because, Armenians, they had Christianity much earlier than a lot of other people in that region. I'm not sure. I think they might have had it earlier than even the Romans. Don't quote me on that, but pretty close anyway. That's one of the oldest Christian churches. And Armenian people, they are very much Christian, but their Christianity is very unique and completely different from any other Christian tendency or church or any practice across the world. And they had back, in medieval times, they had a chroniclist who wrote down some of their Armenian legends and tales. And this chroniclist's name, of course, was I'm going to try to pronounce this, Movses Horenatsi. And he was writing a story about an Armenian legend about Queen Seramida. She's the famous queen who supposedly had something to do with the construction of the hanging gardens in Babylon. The bottom line is there was an ancient Armenian legend that claimed some of the buildings and some of the irrigation canals in Armenia were actually built by this queen. But during the recording of these legends, this chronicler, this medieval chronicler, whose name again I repeat was Movses Horenatsi, He wrote down the location of where the city was supposedly built. And so in 1827, the French Asian Society decided to send Frederick von Schultz to investigate. And he arrived there and he found some amazing things. He found buildings carved into the side of the mountains. He found writing and he took pictures. When I say took pictures, of course, they didn't have cameras back then, but what he did have, in fact, were his ability to draw, like a lot of explorers at the time did, and he took very accurate illustrations of what he had seen. I'm going to show you just a couple of them. Now, in 1829, he got caught up in a local regional conflict between Kurds and other peoples. Bottom line is he got killed. But his everything, all the materials that he collected, all his expedition notes, they were published in 1840 in France. And people got very curious about what it is that they were looking at, because they were looking at cuneiform, but this cuneiform was unlike any other cuneiform they have seen. It was modified. Now it was, of course, based of the same, because cuneiform is more or less universal. You know how we have like Russian alphabet, Slavic, Cyrillic alphabet, we have Latin alphabet. Cuneiform, you can't really do that with. You just have one cuneiform. What you do is you adjust it to your language and create maybe little special signs and stuff like that, some variations. But basically, if anything is written in cuneiform, the reason why people today know how to read Sumerian language, though there's no surviving speakers and there's no surviving related languages, is because cuneiform generally has certain rules on how it's read, with some variations. So they discovered that there was a new language, unfamiliar language, and that these cuneiform labels, these cuneiform texts were written in an unfamiliar language. So people got very curious what it was and started trying to decipher it, of course, going off the notes that von Schmidt left. And he also did a couple other things. I just want to give him the credit since he did die doing this. I mean, he was the first one to describe the Vaughan mountainside and the ancient residence of the kings of Urartu. And he also found the capital city of Urartu, and that is Tushpe. But the thing that really pushed forward the studying and the interest in this culture was when different Assyrian records started getting discovered. And when in Nineveh, Sargon's palace was discovered, and other things were discovered on Nimrud. Many, as we talked before, many Assyrian clay tablets were found, and in those tablets were endless mention of this country that they first called Nivea, then they called it Urartu, and constant wars that Assyrians were waging against these very formidable opponents. And those Assyrian notes really are the best source we have right now about history of Urartu as such, because the Urartians themselves, though they were literate and they did write different texts, most of their texts were official king's notices to the peoples, or of achievements, or I built this, or I am a great this and that, and I've taken the throne. It's kind of trying to reconstruct modern history of the United States just by official statements published by the State Department, or by the president's spokesman, and not knowing anything else about what was going on besides those official statements. So language, of course, presented a very great challenge to figure out what this language was. Several people made several guesses. Some thought it might be related to Proto-Armenian, which we will talk about towards the end of this conversation. That's a very hot topic for debate today. Some guessed was related to other various languages, anything from Sumerian to, I don't know, you pick Chechen. It's actually kind of less than Hurrite, but it's Hurrian, Hurrite, but it is related to. But Georgian scientist Melikishvili in the 50s, he had translated the entire collection of different writings that were found in the state in Urartu, and having done this, he pretty much provided an invaluable to this day resource for those people who are interested in studying this culture, because he has collected not many. Really, here's the thing. I mean, people who were living there later on were Christians, and Christians, just like other people who are monotheistic, have a very lovely tendency when they decided that if they find something that looks different, they take a hammer and usually smash it to little bits and pieces, which they were very happily doing up until very recently. And unfortunately, thusly, we lost access to a lot of these materials that were up until then in plenitude, lying all around what later became an archaeological site. So oftentimes they would write these texts, they would use the Assyrian letters, but because the Assyrian letters did not really fit really well with the language itself.
Is this cuneiform characters carved into rock rather than in mud?
Right. That is correct.
Interesting.
They did most of the stuff that survived was basically from stone carvings, and they usually would have dedication writings and so on and so forth. Brits dug there, and that's why the British Museum and the Berlin Museum have some of the biggest collections in the world of various artifacts from Urartu. Then Imperial Russia sent their expeditionary archaeological force there. They dug there. And finally, Piotrovsky, and this is a person whose name we're going to be mentioning a lot here. Piotrovsky was an archaeologist, a Soviet archaeologist, who set out to find and learn about this culture. And he did. And he wrote a very interesting book that has some political debate around it, as everything else around it right now, because it was in the time of Stalin, and of course any scientist who was practicing in the time of Stalin is of course by default discredited, right? Because everybody who lived in Stalin's time is of course a collaborator. No, he was not a collaborator. He was an archaeologist. He did incredible work. He found an enormous amount of artifacts. He published meticulously everything that he found, described everything. It was meticulous, slow, very cautious, very proper archaeological excavations, and he's what sparked a boom of interest in Urartu in the Western world once his publications came out. And I'm actually using his material, a lot of material from his book here in the Kingdom of Vaughan, because he didn't want to call the country Urartu, because Urartu may have been something that may or may not have related to that particular political formation rather than the territory. Does that make sense? I'm stopping and letting people jump in for a second.
Okay, just wanted to make a point of comment about it. They found hanging gardens in Nevera, but never, how you say it? They still haven't found them in Babylon. But otherwise, these people were pretty incredible. I'm learning a lot here. Basically, we're talking, what, 1400 BC. They had, being very close, Assyria and Urartu had kind of wore each other out. And it even though Assyria was conquering much of the West all the way to the Mediterranean, it pinned down forces that they might have been able to use elsewhere. And Urartu probably wasn't as strong, but they were in their mountain kind of stronghold. So,
okay, and I wanted to say that David was mentioning that they didn't find the gardens of Babylon. That's very debatable. Some claim to have found it, some don't. But bottom line is the gardens of Babylon, hanging gardens, would have existed around 620 or something along those lines of BC. And we're talking about structures that were built completely at a different time. So this is just a legend, and you know how folk legends, how people's folklore tends to take different historical events from completely different time periods, kind of smash them together and make people who lived in one century act in a different century, and rewrite some of the things that people's memory might not like. For example, if they lost a war, then in folklore they might have won it. That's a pretty common occurrence. So Piotrovsky had a treasure trove when he started excavating a citadel at Karmir Blur that was sacked and burned to the ground with everything and everyone in it. When the citadel was surrounded and burned down, here's how Urartu was able to counter the Assyrians. No, they did not have as capable of an army. They were not as militarily strong. They were not as singularly minded and crazily fanatically organized, but they learned how to build forts. Amazing strongholds up on the top. And we're going to look at some of the pictures here in a minute. These strongholds were so, they look like medieval castles. I mean, that early on in history, we're looking at something that looks very much like medieval castles. They had very complex structure. And these strongholds is what allowed them to kind of counter the Assyrians, because Assyrians back then were yet trying to learn how to take strongholds, plus up in a very mountainous terrain. When your stronghold is up on top of the highest mountain, good luck. So what they would do is they would bring in, almost like medieval times, almost identically, they would bring in all the surrounding population into the citadel. They would close off from the world, and they would bring, of course, their animals in as well. And what they would tend to do is they would place, I don't know how they did it, but all of their animals, horses, cows, goats, would be on the roof of that citadel during the fight. So when the citadel got burned down, not only objects, people, storages of grain, and all the kind of material culture items were trapped underneath, but also the animals who were on the roof at the time who were panicking when the fire broke out. A lot of them fell down and fell off the walls, and so there's a lot of bone material and animal remains found too. And so they were able to identify some of the cattle and some of the different breeds of animals that were being used and have been domesticated at this time, as well as they found a lot of grain remains, just storages and storage, kind of like in Temple of Minotaur in Mycenae, Minoan Palace. They found those large storage. And back then, the technique was very similar between all these different cultures, because really, how else do you protect your grain from evil hamsters, right? You put it in a very big ceramic container. Some of those probably weigh half a ton. So our main source of information, as I already said about Urartu, is really the Assyrian writing. There's some mention in the Hittite text, some mentioned here and there in the Bible. Very little is known about these people, and nothing almost was known about their way of life until these excavations began, this archaeological searches. So different things were found. They found, of course, a lot of metal objects that didn't melt. They found weapons. They found, remains of defensive armor. They found, of course, animal remains, food storages, and human remains. So when Piotrowski finished his first expedition, when he published his first book, again, that's called The Kingdom of Vaughan, and that's the material I'm using here. And he published this material. It had an effect of an exploding bomb. And suddenly the world, he thought at the time, found out about this amazing civilization, just like we have found out about the Hittites, which disappeared such a long time ago that there were some vague mentions in the Bible, but for the longest time, nobody even remembered that there was such a mighty, empire as the Hittites. And now suddenly people knew about it. So how did this empire, how did this state come to form so early on in human history? Well, a couple of things. First of all, we've got to look at the geography. Now, of course, the Armenian Highlands, they're very high up, and they have very varied climates and very varied environments. You have saltwater lakes, you have freshwater lakes, you have many rivers. There's lush valleys. There's really kind of formidable and hard to approach mountain cliffs. It's fairly cold winter there. Temperatures there range greatly. So different places in that region could be used for different, for agriculture, for breeding cattle, herding, and so on and so forth. And so there was a lot of variety within the peoples who lived there. But of course, originally it was a bunch of tribes. And the thing that brought these tribes together, the thing that made them unite and actually surrender to the idea of being under kind of a single state, is because the Assyrians kept raiding and raiding and raiding and raiding and taking their cattle and taking their people and making more slaves and taking more cattle and taking more people and so on and so forth. And so the Urartian territory population said, we're going to do this together. And they united into a single kind of ethnic formation. Now, originally, when they started coalescing, as always, there was about, a couple of states there, but those states, as time went on, started eating one another until there was only one left, at least in that particular territory. So these people, of course, were fairly advanced. Like, as I mentioned, they had a lot of natural resources there. To this day, Caucasus, there is a reason why Nazis were trying so hard to take over the Caucasus, because there's all kinds of natural resources there, as far as metals go, as far as various other, oil, all kinds of stuff. Wonderful stones of every kind, from, marble to various stone that could be used for building constructions. Rich climate that is rich and interesting. So very early on, people there went from hunting and gathering. They started switching over to agriculture and to domestication. Their breeds of animals, their breeds of seeds were very different. Grains were very similar to what was happening in Mesopotamia, because those two regions were constantly intermixing and people were migrating back and forth. So that was a constant back and forth flow. The main difference being that the people up in the mountains preferred shorter cows and not as tall of cows as by that point in time already was starting to be bred in Mesopotamia, because really large cows do not do well jumping back and forth from mountaintop to mountaintop, right? As Hannibal showed us with his elephants very well. I'm going to stop, see if anybody has anything to jump in with. Is this interesting material, guys? Is this something new to you, or? Because I have not seen a lot of in-depth. I don't think it's very well studied.
I just have a question.
What is it?
Do they use clay tablets?
They didn't really do a lot of, not many have been found, at least because it's believed that they mainly just used Assyrian writing just to communicate official state messages. Not
Yeah,
David just asked
their
them. They used clay writing, though they did not do writing as extensively as the rest of Mesopotamia. They didn't seem to need it as much. They used it for, once they came in contact with Assyria and they saw what Assyrian state machine was like, they had to put something together to counter it. And so they started emulating it in a lot of ways, the way that Urartian government, the way it was shaped in some ways, the way their kings, titled and carried themselves and represented themselves. A lot of it was learned from. It was something that evolved almost in kind of this constant struggle with the neighboring Assyria that was their frenemy, mostly enemy really, but because I can't imagine anybody being friends with Assyria too much as a state. Nathan, did you want to say something?
Yes. So one, speaking of the writing, that tablet or that stone tablet that you showed, that was carved in high relief.
Yeah.
And just an observation from my point. One, that was carved in high relief, and to carve in high relief takes a tremendous amount more work than carving in low relief. So whatever that tablet said would be really interesting that was very important. And so some questions is, because it's about roughly about the same time, and because of their geographical positioning, it kind of looks like they're on the trade routes between East and West. And so they have a very strategic, important economic position. And also, so that's one question, kind of like an open question to fill out. And the other is, did they have any involvement with the Trojan War?
Okay, let me jump in there. You're absolutely right. And not just Urartu, but the whole region, the entire region of Caucasus has been kind of a place that got steamrolled back and forth by different cultures throughout history. Because you're absolutely right. Not only did they have all the strategic and important resources, but they also were the pathway really from one place to the other. So never-ending enemy invasions and never-ending migrations back and forth of different ethnicities, tribes, formations. As far as their involvement in the Trojan War, I have not heard anything about that, but there are some people who are claiming that at least very, very early cultures may have had some sort of interaction with cultures such as the Etruscan culture. I mentioned before as the Pelops culture in the Greece, with the Minoans. There's some artifacts from those cultures found there and vice versa. Does that make sense? So if that was happening, I don't see why they might have not at least, I doubt they took active part in war in Troy, because back then they didn't have awesome Apache helicopters. They could, I think, kind of in a sense of a proxial way through their products, some of their products. Plus, like I said, some researchers believe that it was one of the main sources of the original kind of boom of metallurgy, all kinds of metallurgy. It's one of the regions where iron was actually used earlier than just about anywhere else. They were known to be an amazing smith. They were, if you look at the story of Jason, there's some notifications there of how rich that region was, because what is the golden rune, right? Some researchers think that it's just a sheepskin that was placed in a spring or kind of a shallow river to pick up gold flake that was going through there. And if that's the case, that's a pretty good indicator of what this region was like. If you could walk by with a skin a sheep, stick it in the water, kaboom, you have golden rune, right? So yeah, it was a very coveted piece of territory. So about the name, again, I talked a little bit about it. I just want to give you guys a little bit more of a glimpse into how interesting this region is named. So there's, as I said, there's Urartu, there's Bainini, then there is the word Vaughan, which is was used by the Soviet archaeologists and other researchers to kind of neutrally indicate that this is a political formation separate from a tribe of people who might have called themselves this, separate from the territory that might be called this. Does that make sense? And then another thing is Nairi is another thing that was used to call that region again. That's like the northern region. That's in the Assyrian language. Ararat, I've mentioned before. There's Alarod. Herodotus mentions this as Alarod or Alarodia. Chaldea. I mean, I'm sure you all have heard in the Bible about the Chaldeans. That's another name that was often associated with them, or some researchers believe may have been. Arrata is an ancient mountainous country that was mentioned as far as back 3,000 years ago, and some researchers originally guessed it might be in some way related to Urartu, just because it sounds very similarly. Modern researchers kind of drifted away from that thought, but either way, there's just not enough resources for that, not enough sources to make that assessment. So we really don't know. The population of this, like I said, of this region was ethnically not homogeneous. There was varied people there. And anybody who tried to unite anybody in that region had to be constantly at war with the neighboring tribes to try to make them somewhat friendly and not so warlike. And this continues to this day, by the way, as we all know. So Urartu formed as a state. It started forming towards somewhere between 8th to 9th century before 8th to 9th century before our time, basically. So the very first mention we see about Urartu is in Assyrian Salmanasara 1. Gosh, I can never pronounce these Assyrian names. They're a little bit interesting to say the least. I have easier time with the various Urartu names, honestly. So the kings of Urartu in that period of time were already at war. And the kings, no, not king, but kings of Urarti or Uratriri or all the other million ways that those peoples are called. So basically they were tribal leaders who were at war with the Assyrians already at that time. Assyrian wars at that time generally just went in there, took what they wanted, and then bailed. So here's the description of this one of those particular journeys to rob, pillage, and steal and enslave from the name of Salmanasara 1. At the beginning of my rule, the countries of Urartu rebelled against me. Seeing this, I called upon my lord Ashur and other gods, my lords. I arranged the gathering of my troops. I climbed the cliffs of their mighty mountains to reach the countries of Hime, Vatgun, Bargun, Salua, Khalia, Luha, Nibharti, and Zingur, Zingan. I conquered 8 countries and their armies. 51 settlements I destroyed, burned, took captives and property. In 3 days' time, I made all the countries of Urartu bow at the feet of Ashur, who is my lord. I took their children and made them my servants. I laid mountainous and eternal tribute upon those lands. Right? Needless to say that his son and the son of his son and whoever took the throne after that pretty much was also trying to bring these same people at the feet of Ashur, and somehow it just never quite worked out that way. So very early on, Assyrians had their hands all up in that territory. So like I've already mentioned, oftentimes in Assyrian text, the name of Urartu and the name Nairi is intermixed, but it's unclear whether or not when they talk about Nairi, they mean a wider territory than when they talk about Urartu. That's kind of a question. And so by constantly attacking these tribes, the Assyrians got what they wanted. They got a state that coalesced and decided to defend itself. When the very first king of that land, legendary king Arama, came to power, and he is considered to be the uniting force, the king who brought these peoples together. Let me show you some of the maps as we talk about these various conquests, because you will see about how the territory, even of this one country, just flexes back and forth. So right here, again, is a map of this Kolchida, that's Georgia. Basically, this is Assyria. Now, this is 743. Now, we're talking about something that happened in 858, 856 BC, but just so that you have a rough idea how this land is squished between various other kingdoms. So let's see, this is a map from Piotrowski book. This is hand-drawn map, and it's 1969 map, and that is his at the time when he was doing his excavations. That's where he thought the territory of Urartu was located. And you see some of the Araratas mountain here. There's Armenia, different rivers and so on. Azerbaijan, modern day. Well, that's not modern day, that's how it was back in the Soviet times anyway. So here, and I'm sorry because this, nope, that's the wrong king. Let me find the right one. Okay, so during the King Arames, that's 860, 840, about his rule. So here we're looking at yellow is the territory, most likely they, meaning the, of course, Urartu people, Urartu kingdom lived. The territory right here is, of course, mighty Assyrians, right? And so, yeah, I mean, this is various expeditions by the Assyrians up against the Urartu people. This is the first king, and this is pretty early on. So, and you can see like this little sign right here is where various battles were fought. Salmanasar III was able to take and destroy the cities of Surgunia and Arzashku, which were the very first capitals of early Urartu. Was not able to make it much further than that. After that, another king came into power, and this is a legendary king. This is Sarduri the First, and he came to power about 844. So this is the same territory. That's again, yellow is the Urartu kingdom. This is the Assyrian. Sarduri was a very mighty king. He was the one who built Tushpa, the capital, the grand capital of the Vaughan Kingdom. He created a whole network of defensive. A lot of these writings, they were found like this. So a lot of times they would build a building and then dedicate it with a sort of writing. This is one of the photographs from the first Soviet expedition. That's what their citadels look like. I mean, these things were mighty and quite formidable. That's right here. That's one of the pictures of what this king may have looked like, and that's Sarduri the First. That's a reconstruction of what he might have looked like in real life. Okay, so here are the fortresses. This is probably the residence of the kings. I mean, good luck taking that, really. Different views. I mean, these look like medieval fortifications, don't they? And so, being a very, he was kind of the first king was a legendary person, but Sarguri, he was the king who brought together the kingdom. He was kind of like, let's see, what would be like a first founding king of some kingdom for me? Give me like Akkadian kings. Or
That's a bad example.
okay, like Charlemagne in a way. Kind of Clovis,
That's actually
yeah, that's so anyway. So Sarduri, whose father was Lutipri, who was not a king, by the way, we have no idea who his father was, has left, for example, a following dedication in one of the buildings. He said, this is written by Sarduri, who is the son of Lutipri, a great king, mighty king, king of the universe, king of the Nairi country, king who has no one equal to him. He who shepherds countries and peoples of Nairi, shepherd who is not afraid of wars and battles, king who made those who did not want to obey him. Sarduri, who is the son of Lutipri, speaks thus: I have brought the sandstone from the city of Al-Nuru. I have built this wall. And that's kind of the dedication, typical dedication message that you would find in some of the buildings. So during the Sarduri time, of course, Assyrians kind of had to slow down in their stealing of peoples and, taking away various herds and getting a lot of useful and very, very necessary for the function of early kingdoms, slaves. Because they could not get to the capital anymore, because there was this network of defensive citadels all around the country. And even though the Urartian army consistently lost any head-to-head battle with the Assyrians, they learned from their previous mistakes and decided that the head-to-head battle was probably not the best way to go about it. So they would use their protective and various fortifications and other defensive measures. And so now Assyrians were facing not only the harsh winter climate, and they could only wage war in the summer because the Assyrians were not used to such cold winters. They were faced with, the formidable and really high up. So now we have mountains covered by snow, and on top of the mountains, a citadel that looks like a mountain covered by snow. Yeah, we're not going to storm that. So this led to the blooming, to the golden age of Urartu. And so the next couple of kings had it really nice, really nice. So the next two kings, and that would be Ishpuini, who was the son of Sarduri, and the next king, who was named Menua. They were able to widen and work on bettering their kingdom that they now received as inheritance from the previous king. And so they were able to add this territory. They have been able to march down to the valley and take some very fertile lands under their control. They started centralizing the religion, as as rulers tend to do. So various pantheons of various tribes were now being unified and put into kind of some sort of an order and cohesion. So the main gods were designated now as the three main gods, and I'm going to show you a picture of them. and that's Haldi, which is the name Chaldeans comes from. That's Haldi right here, and there's an image of him. He was the higher god who was often shown standing on top of a lion, riding a lion. So there's Haldi, and that's the great god who is riding a lion. And he's and this is important to remember, his city, his cult city was Musasir, which later on, when that city winds up being taken much later towards the end of Urartu history, the collapse of his religious center is going to lead to collapse of the religion, because when your god's temple is getting raided and destroyed and nothing happens in return, people tend to think that God is not such a great and mighty deity.
Except for Ishtar.
Well, Ishtar, yeah. Taisheba, who was the god of thunder and war, he oftentimes was shown riding a bull. And the next god was an important one, is the god of the sun, and we will see that image later on, much later on, in Sassanid, Persia, that image of winged sun disk. And this is the god of sun, who was always shown as the winged sun disk, right? That image is going to travel through time. It's going to be decorating Zoroaster later on. It's something that is going to deeply influence the entire history of that region. And this god's name is Shivini. And at this time, that's when they invent first tablets of their own modified cuneiform start appearing, where they kind of do start picking up a little bit of that administrative, and they never were big about keeping history. You know how the Hittites kept meticulous records of everything from bureaucracy to war to, various palace stuff to, people would write their own, even their own memoirs, or at least would pseudo memoirs, right? To where these people they were more along the same lines as the Mycenaean people back in the day. They just wrote down the important stuff, but were not so big on writing down religion or let alone daily life, right? So when Manoah came to power, who was the grandson of the very first king, he ruled about 786. He had added more very mighty citadels, now protecting that inner region of the Lake of Vaughan. Let me go back to this, and protecting that inner. And he also built canals. So this right here is a dedication of one of the canals. He built canals that run to this day. These canals to this day are used by people who live in Armenia, and they're known as Semiramis canals. So there's a picture, modern day picture of that canal. That canal is enormous, and it was built that far back. So, and that canal brought water to Tushpa, and because those regions are somewhat droughty-ish, it was important to have a very serious irrigation system. So the next couple kings really invested in betterment of the land, betterment of the region, and they built these incredible canals. There's an edge of the canal, that's where the dedication is. Again, there's the citadel. So this is the temple of Shivini, or potentially temple of, the temples look very similar. And there is some belief that actually the architectural style is what influenced later on. You were asking me about the Trojan War. I don't know about the Trojan War, but the architecture in Greece definitely was somewhat affected by these distant images. This is a reconstruction, these are two great statues. When those go two great statues, I think this actually, I'm wrong, this is the god Haldi, the Haldean temple. When the Assyrians took the city and took the statues with them, people were not pleased, to say the least. They were enormous, but you can see kind of a little bit of that Greek echo in this architecture. Another thing that they were known for, and that's when you read about Atlantis, they like to take different color limestone and make their walls multicolored. They really like to do that. There's several examples of that. And you see, again, doesn't that remind you a little bit of a Greek architecture, even more than a little bit in a way? So, like I said, this culture had just absolutely incredible impact on future. So by this point in time, during this period of golden age of Urartu, their borders got all the way to Euphrates River. And the kings lived in this citadel, which was very mighty, and that's near the Lake Vaughan, which was pretty much unapproachable. You can see how high it is if you're coming up from from below the mountain level. You're looking up there, and these kings are truly up in the sky. So here's another interesting thing. Inside the mountain itself, they made quite a few rooms, halls, and other carvings. So bottom line is, not only did they build above the ground, but they also made rooms beneath the ground. So this was, what you see on top is not all of the citadel. This whole mountain is a citadel.
Just briefly, the depictions of the kings, and so one's riding the bull.
Those are the gods.
Yep. And they're the lion, and it looks like they're holding incense burners.
Yeah, and that was pretty common because you know why the candles
and so to Orthodox Christian Church. I'm just wondering if there's a tie there.
Yeah, there is. There absolutely is. So the reason why to this day, you often hear of burnt offerings, right? Over and over in the Bible and various other ancient art writings, in any sort of religious text throughout human history anywhere. How do you sacrifice something to the gods, right? You send it up to heaven. If in your religion and your cosmology, Egyptians probably wouldn't do that because their idea where the gods lived was a little bit more convoluted. But you would send, and even Egyptians did, send stuff up to the sky, send the stuff up to where the gods reside. Greeks did that, modern Christians do that with the candles. What do you do when you cremate somebody? It's the same thing, right? Why is that the case? Because everything in this world is subject to gravity except for one thing, flame. Does that make sense? So when you're cremating a person and you're turning them into a cloud of smoke, it's their soul rising up. When you take the body of a bull, or you take some fruits and you burn them up, the smell and the vapors and the smoke rises up to the sky. So it is the exact same. There's no difference between the candles that are lit today in Orthodox churches and those ancient incense. That's why incense has always been such an essential part of religion, because the smell, the scent,
that's a big thing about it. I've been to services that use incense, and it's a very powerful smell. But they do this to put the smoke on you, and what it does, it goes into your clothing. So later that day, if you move or something, you'll get the scent, and it transports you immediately back to the service. So you think of God and that relationship you have, and it's like it's ongoing all the time because of the smell that lingers. So it's not just wafting prayer to the gods. It's actually giving you that experience that you'll keep with you, which is kind of cool.
Right. No, that's an absolutely valid point. You're absolutely right about that. These are some war and images in their art, but they much like Assyrians. But if you notice, they're kind of not like Assyrians, because Assyrians are a little bit more detailed. Assyrians are a little bit more about their beard ever since they conquered Babylon, right? They like their beard, nice style, and their headgear is very different. If you notice that, and also pay attention to the noses. By the way, these guys also had chariots and so forth. Though they didn't see that pay attention to the noses though. Their chariots were very different. This is a scene of a battle, I think, and gods and whatever else is going on, but there's obviously somebody's climbing up, somebody's running somewhere. There's a lot of, they emulated Assyria in a lot of ways. But I was going to say, if you guys don't mind me sidewinding for a second. So what you were just saying, Chris, about there's the scent element, but also there's the idea when you really have two ways of disposing of a body. Well, three ways you can expose it, right? Which some cultures do, which is in case when you believe that the body and the soul, or whatever you want to call it in your religion, are not correlated, and in other words, that the body is not in any way sacred. It's like dirty clothing that you take off when you die. Those cultures usually expose their dead, because to them that body sometimes can even serve as a grave to trap the spirit in, and until you completely disassemble, dismember, destroy the body, that spirit is going to be trapped and unhappy and stuck inside of rotting flesh. The other two ways that are more common really are either burying in the ground, which of course signifies the idea of planting a seed, and that's why they oftentimes buried in an embryo position so they can be reborn again, kind of like a new plant is born from a planted seed. Or there's the cremation, and cremation is again the soul of the warriors is rising up, and that's why, for example, in Scandinavian religion, much much later on, the echo of that is when you have the warriors cremated, but the people who are more agriculturalists tend to be buried. Just to wrap up with this thing, I just want to get to the end of the first stage of what we can call the Assyrian Wars, until Urartu was actually able to kind of establish itself. Not getting murdered by Assyrians all the time in horrible ways, okay? We'll call it that. I guess I call that peace. So another thing that this location was extremely well known for is horses. Horses from the steppes were delivered through the Caucasus to Assyria, and so when Urartu managed to get back up on its feet and stopped and placed economic sanctions upon the Assyrian invaders and aggressors, among those sanctions, of course, were horses, which was an essential military transport, right? So Assyrian ruler Salaman Sar the Fourth had spent 6 years out of his 10 years on the throne trying to do something about Urartu, and he failed miserably. By that point in time, Menuet was already, Menuet II was ruling in Urartu. Here's, for example, some of the written sources that are from the point of view of the Urartian people, how this whole military conflict looked like. So, by the greatness of God, Chaldi, Arkishiti, the son of Menuet, and that's the king on the throne right now, built this mighty fortress, established her name, Yerebuni, for the power of the Biani country and for the intimidation of the enemies. The land was deserted, but I rebuilt it mightily. And by the great God's Chaldi blessing, I, Akshiti, son of Manoah, am a powerful king, king of the Biani country, and the ruler of the city of Tushpa. Argishiti the first, it's about around 780s, 760s. Urartu was at its last setting sun of its golden age. And the Assyrian Tsar king, whatever you want to call him, Salmanasar the Fourth, who lived at the same time as the king Agrishiti, titled the Urartian king thusly: Agrishiti Huzurat, whose name is terrible, like the black storm, and whose forces are mighty. So that's the time when Assyria actually agreed, yeah, you guys do have geopolitical interests, you are a real entity in a country, we will negotiate. So, having learned from the frenemies, Urartian kings structured their power within the country very similarly to the way that their worst enemies, the Assyrians, did. They had despotic and absolute control, and they wanted to control the whole region around them and make sure their borders are locked down, nobody can get through, there's no buffer zones, mine. They oftentimes would have to suppress the rebelling local tribes, though they did not tend to exhibit, or at least they may have even exhibited as much cruelty as the Assyrians, but they just didn't tend to draw it in meticulous details, so we don't know anything about their war crimes. But still, this whole region in a way remained kind of a hodgepodge of different languages and peoples and loosely associated tribes that periodically tried to kind of skedaddle out of the union and had to be brought back into the fold. They borrowed the entire military defense complex from the Assyrians, as well as the social model. They tried to build as much irrigation as possible to improve the agriculture in their territory. They've taken from Assyrians, as I said before, their cuneiform and started writing happily and a lot. They tried to consolidate their religion as much as they could, though they didn't quite go as far as Assyrians and did not decide that they were going to be more or less monotheistic. Their art became very Assyrianized, very canonized, kind of, how Babylonian, Assyrian art, that's very kind of standing on the head of my enemies, right? So they kind of took that on. Again, less horrible graphic murder scenes, but very militarized, very formalized art form, not very realistic. But their biggest achievement at the time is that they were better than anybody else in building defensive forts. And that's where we're going to leave our lovely Urartians for now at the peak of their might. They kind of like Rome in its final days when the sun is about to set, but it hasn't yet. And it's that beautiful time in the day when everything looks golden and it's nice and warm and the birds are singing and you think you're on top of the world. And then it starts going down.
Actually, I think the Assyrians may have crossed the Atlantic and became the Aztecs.
Yeah, you know what? That's not, you should publish a book like that. You know what? You'll be the next sensation and book of the year.
I'll see myself out the door.
Right. No, I think that's a pretty darn good way of saying it.
Because there are people who actually suggested things like that in the past, especially between the Egypts and the Aztecs and the Incas and stuff.
Right.
It's actually been suggested.
Right. First, they got on a time machine, right, and jumped a couple centuries, right?
Right.
But no, but that's what I'm saying. It probably would be the bestseller. New York Times, it would not. Or Bloomberg.
Well, Thor Heyerdahl across the Atlantic in a papyrus boat just to show it can be done.
Mhm.
Yeah, true that. True that. Okay, guys. So and I hope this is not. I'm not being too boring here, but I mean, this is like an empire that is at least very as great as any of the ones we've talked about. Is certainly similar to Hittites in its might and in its span. Maybe not as militarily mighty, but just as politically complex. With just as much social. And we will talk a little bit later in the second half of all of their achievements and the metallurgy. That's their helmets at the time. You see those very specific. They almost look medieval, don't they? Like early medieval, like Rus helmets, early Viking times.
Or Hershey's Kiss.
True that. Again, chariots. Chariots were used quite often. That bull motif. They had these. I will find some more images like this. But they had these things where they would have like various metal, large sacrificial, I don't know what they're called, really big bowls, cauldrons, whatever, that they will have really interesting decorations like this. All of these are just like decorative pieces that will be attached around the cauldron. They also have a bunch of those with people's heads and birds' wings. This is furniture feet, by the way. Can you imagine having a chair with those kind of feet? I think that'd be kind of a little bit weird. But I thought it was pretty unique. That's also from Piotrovsky sketches. Also from Piotrovsky sketches, this is, that motif you oftentimes see in the Scythians, the predator that is clawing or that is tearing up prey. Very similar idea. And this was this is a decorative figure on a clay figure on the edge of a clay pot. Again, bird bull creature. You have the bull, you have the bird. You also kind of have the hand almost here. Isn't that interesting? This idea of, see how their bulls are very different from the Assyrian and Babylonian bulls. They're the same winged bulls, but these are sides to a chair, for example, oftentimes, or throne. You see a lot of these.
Sure that's not a griffin?
That's not a griffin. I mean, it's a griffin. I mean, it's all of the above. No, that's the winged bull. That's the typical Babylonian Assyrian. These drinking horns, you see how finely detailed that horse is. I mean, that's almost modern art, isn't it? It's almost lifelike. So in that sense, their art was. And these kind of, when we talked about Anunnaki, the creatures that came from whatever planet, abracadabra, on fifth galaxy out and beyond the skies. And yeah, they're like, did I mention in the last? Well, that's where they got some of these images. It kind of does look Aztec, doesn't it? Except for the nose. People from Caucasus, I love your noses. I mean, no offense, I'm serious. This is Sargon, which we'll talk about later. That's the ruler of their enemies. And this is what a warrior may have looked at that time. I mean, this looks fairly modern comparing to even the Greek warriors, that some of them operated somewhat later in this time period. So, I mean, these people are just unique and they're interesting, and they had such high technology that some people think that when, you hear about the Anunnaki, when the Sumerians talk about the Anunnaki, they might be talking about people that came about either the Hurrians or the Urartu, various Urartu related tribes that may have come down with this super high technology, with their metallurgy down from these high mountain tops. And again, that's a supposition, it's a legend. I don't know if it's true, but it's an interesting idea to think that Anunnaki may have not been some weird alien creatures. They might have been just people that came down from the mountains. Does anybody have anything interesting or not, or boring to say?
Well, I really appreciate the, if you will, the anecdotal story of Jason and the Argonauts and the Golden Fleece. And that's beautiful. It makes a lot of sense. And I would say the Golden Fleeces, and that I have friends of mine here in Wyoming in the mountains that prospect by that very same method.
Right. It's all
and they're actually surprisingly successful doing it.
Right.
It makes more sense in the pain.
Definitely makes more sense. And especially when you have such rich waters, all you have to do is really just run it through.
And it also tells me that there's more to this area than just trade routes or a strategic position. And there's a lot to vie for here.
Right.
And so and when you have an area rich in natural resource and also trade routes, access, then it's going to be fought over through in perpetuity.
Chechens or Georgians, Armenians, Azerbaijanians, or any other Ossetians, just name any peoples there. I mean, these are honorable people, beautiful people, very very kind, people who will do anything for a friend, people who will never allow you to leave their house hungry, people who will spend their last penny but make sure that their friend is taken care of, warmly, happily, people who respect their elders, people who respect other people's traditions when they're not at each other's throats.
Right.
And, there's not a single person, not a single population in that region, I think, that is not worthy, absolutely worthy of being known and recognized and respected. So, and I'm not saying that to be politically correct. I really do enjoy Caucasian people. I enjoy the sound of their language. It's very unusual to a European ear. It has a lot of sh sounds. If you guys are interested, just do a search, Caucasian languages spoken, and just hear some of them. They're all very different. They're very musical. They're just unique and wonderful peoples, and I'm glad they exist on this planet when so many other peoples have gone that have appeared since their time. So that's pretty much it. Anybody else with any commentary or thoughts? I didn't bore everybody to death today. 9?
No, this is actually fascinating.
Awesomeness. Take care, everyone. It's always a pleasure.
That exist within every man's soul, and we will live forever, or as long as stories are told.